Hello friends, welcome to today's daily devotion. I'm Kerry Wood from the Goldston Methodist Church in Goldston, North Carolina, and we are continuing to go through what this week seems to be a boatload of controversy as Paul is putting into very practical terms what he sees as being the way of living in Christ. And today we're looking at Colossians chapter 3, closing out the chapter from verse 22 to Colossians chapter 4, verse 1. Hear now these words. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. And do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all of your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. So we've had the controversy around husbands and wives, controversy around children's and dads, parents in general, and now we have this huge one, slavery. Is Paul promoting the acceptance of slavery? Is the Bible geared towards the idea that humans owning humans is an okay thing? For much of human history, that's been the case. We have lived in culture after culture, century after century, millennia after millennia that thought that it was okay for a human to own another human and to be able to tell that other human everything they can and can't do, and be able to either give them food and shelter and clothing or refuse them food and shelter and clothing, all based on ownership. So is that what Paul is doing here? Well, I think we need to step back and remind ourselves what Paul is doing here. When he began his letter, he said, "This is to those who are in Christ in Colossae." In the first century in Colossae, there were people who were in Christ that were slaves and owners of slaves. I would suspect that if Paul was writing this to those of us in our cultural context today, he might frame this differently, but the instructions within that frame would be identical. Because what Paul is saying here is not accept slavery, but rather whatever your condition of life is, here's how you live out of that condition to be beyond that condition. In other words, we need to live for Jesus in whatever the context is in which we find our lives. And so when he deals with slaves and masters, Paul is again bending the rules to encompass Christ over and above those cultural rules, those cultural norms. What's interesting is that here in the 21st century, slavery still exists. And you and I need to do everything we can to eradicate this concept of a human being able to own another human being. We tend to think of slavery in the antebellum times here in America, where you had black people being owned by white people and forced to work the fields in the South, in the Confederacy, in the Cotton era. Today, sexuality is a more likely source of slavery. Young children, both girls and boys, forced to do sexual acts with adults if those kids want to survive. But that's not surviving, is it? That is horrid. It's terrible. And there is no place for that when we are in Christ. And so it is appropriate for us to fight against slavery. It is also appropriate for us to understand that within our context of what we live, everything that we do is out of sincerity of heart and reverence to the Lord. This is controversial. This is hard to deal with. So how do you deal with this? What are the ways in which this pushes your buttons? Let's have a civil conversation, a Christ-like conversation as we work our way through these controversial ideas, because what Paul is writing is caught up in his first century context, but it still can have a 21st century application. So how do you apply these words today? And I'll see you tomorrow for another daily devotion.